some point in the future we'll actually be in the same space together. We hope. But yeah, very good to have you with us, Ed.
Great to be here, and hopefully next year in London we'll all be live in the same room.
I look forward to that, definitely. And I thought it would be useful just to give us a bit of an angle, a bit of a way into this big subject. So we published a report yesterday, had an event on it, which was about the return to the office, and we were comparing return to office patterns in London, Toronto, New York, Sydney, Paris, and Singapore to see what was similar, what was different. So I thought it'd be useful is that my colleague Paul Swinney, who led that project, is going to say a few words about the report and what we found, and then that'll give us a way to get into the different aspects that I want to explore with you. What's going on, obviously, on your side of the ocean, but also, you know, your broader reflections on where we are in the cities debate. So, Paul, over to you for 5 minutes on return to the office, the report, and then we'll come back and have a conversation with Ed.
Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. Yes, we published our report yesterday, Return to the Office, where we presented results, where we surveyed employees, but also decision makers too. So getting the employee-employer balance on this across 6 cities: London, Paris, New York, Sydney, Singapore, and Toronto. And I remembered all of them as well. So that's a good one. And what was really interesting, cast your mind back to April, May, June 2020, when we were in lockdowns, I think, across all of those countries, and those who could work from home were confined to their houses to work. And we had all sorts of discussions and newspaper columnist articles telling us that the genie was out of the bottle, the office was dead, the downtown was dead, and no one would ever come back to the office. Now, what was interesting from our polling results, and I'm sure as we know from lived experience from across the world, that patently now, 4 years later, is not the case. We have seen a return back to the office. The question is, how large has that been? How strong has that been? How does it vary across those different places? And does it really matter? So it's interesting, I think, when you look across across all the different places that there has been this return. The reasons why are fascinating. So there are 2 main reasons for that. First one is that there are mandates for people to come back, which have tightened in London in particular over the last year. We ran the survey in London last year, and we can see the difference there. So increasing mandates ever more. So there's around about 7% of workers in London, central London now don't have a mandate. So over 90%, over 9 in 10 people do have a requirement to be in the office at least some part of the week. But it isn't just these so-called draconian bosses who are dragging people back. Because when we were asked employees about whether they would come in if there wasn't a mandate in place, the majority said that they would. Now, they would come in less than the mandate itself states, but they still would come into the office. And that was because of the key benefits that they saw of office working. And they were very much around the ability to build relationships with colleagues, to collaborate with colleagues, and to have spark innovations and new ways of doing things by having conversations with colleagues as well. And then the really key things, the important elements of face-to-face interaction, that when we were having these discussions in 2020 about the office being dead, those factors were totally ignored. Now, you can replicate a degree of those through Zoom or through Teams, but you definitely can't get the full amount of it, particularly the serendipitous nature of that, which Ed has written a lot about in his work. And I think that was the bit that was missing in the conversation back then, and why we've then seen employees want to come back to the extent that they have come back so far. What's interesting, though, I think when you compare across the different cities, is that there is a bit of a range in terms of how much that return to the office has happened. So Paris leads the list, 3.5 days, followed by Singapore. But London and Toronto at the other end, around about 2.7 days per week that are spent in the office. Now, that is much higher than 0 days, which we mustn't lose sight of, which was the case, or close to 0, which was the case in 2020 and the first half of 2021 in London's instance. But certainly it is quite a distance still away from where we were pre-pandemic. About 70% of the time that was spent in the office pre-pandemic. I think the question now is that, does that matter? Does it matter that Paris is back more than is the case in London? Have we now reached an equilibrium where this is the new normal? new normal, we're being spattered around a lot, but we haven't actually got to that point. Have we now got there, or is there still room to move on this? And I think that's a very interesting thing for us to debate, given the benefit of face-to-face interaction, given the journey we've been on in the last 3 to 4 years, and then inform where we might end up getting to in the next year, next 2 years, next 10 years. Thanks, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. So turn to you, Ed, and we'll get into, you and I have a bit of a conversation, but as always, if you've got questions or queries for Ed as we go along, put them in the Q&A. Use the Q&A function, put them in. I'll keep an eye on them, and then I'll throw them in as we go along, and we'll see what we can do. I suppose before we'll get into the detail of your reflections on the report, Ed, but let's start with, I mean, in 2012 you wrote a brilliant book called Triumph of the City, and not quite a decade later you then wrote a book which was called Survival of the City. I mean, interesting in itself, the titles, but I mean, given that, where are you now in terms of how you think about the city and where it is and how its importance has waxed and waned, particularly in the more recent period? Where are you just in terms of how you think about our cities from triumph to survival? Where next?
Well, I certainly believe in cities' enduring ability to help mankind to triumph. I certainly believe cities are here to stay. And this is, if we took a non-Western perspective, I think the past 3 years would seem like a very modest blip if we're thinking about sub-Saharan Africa or thinking about India or we're thinking about East Asia. But there's no question that in our wealthy countries, this has been a period of enormous strain for cities, both because there are downsides of density. There are bad things that happen when people live close to one another, and the most terrible of these is contagion. Cities have been dealing with plague for 2,400 years at least. They are vulnerable both because proximity enables the spread of disease and because cities are the nodes on our global lattice of travel and trade. They are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for viruses, and that has made them vulnerable since Athens in the time of Thucydides. And on top of that, at least in the US, there were increasing discontents related to things which I think of as being more US-centric, so unhappiness over racial bias in policing, for example. I mean, one of the great successes in US cities between 1990 and 2010 was the reduction in overall crime, but that reduction happened with far too much, imprisonment, far too much maltreatment of ordinary people, especially people of color. On top of that, there's the housing crisis, which continues to this day, and a sense that cities aren't providing upward mobility for everybody. So I think cities were frayed before COVID, and then COVID hit, and work from home is a real thing. And for all those reasons, cities are facing what appears to be a crisis. But in terms of my enduring beliefs, I think there's no question that cities will survive this crisis, will continue to be vital because they play to what's most essential in us, our ability to work together, to learn from one another, and to take joy in each other's company.
Brilliant. So let's get into a little bit of detail. I mean, Paul said in his sort of opening remarks, give or take, but across the cities at least that we looked at, and obviously they are special in the sense that they are global, they are nodes of the global economy, they are often the primate cities in their own countries, in their own areas. So, the degree to which we can extrapolate to lots of other urban areas, that's a question in and of its own right. But just across the piece, roughly, those places, particularly on a work perspective, return to work perspective, are around 70%, give or take. I mean, it's not back, but it's back substantively. So, and it's quite obvious, I think, that the pandemic and then what happened in behavior changes has kind of changed the way that people feel about their exposure to and their engagement with and the physical aspects of density and being in cities. So I suppose, questions that come from, well, lots of questions from that, but I'm particularly interested in, your thoughts, because you've written extensively on both, is how does this influence the way we think about cities as places of production? When we think about productivity, innovation, creativity, skill development, career progression, all those sort of stuff about, the work of cities and cities as places of work. And then there's a sort of related, obviously, sort of a strand, which is actually cities as places of consumption, places of fun, places of joy, places of interaction, places of pleasure. And we see those. You've written extensively about that. So when we think about the interaction, the 70%, does it make a material difference then how we are then thinking about the role of cities? And is there a difference between the production and the consumption roles that they play?
Oh, I certainly, to take your last question first, I certainly think so. I mean, as soon as the pandemic risk abated, I saw young people around me eager to get back and connecting with other people. And I think, I was in London in June, and certainly the consumption side of the city seemed to be going full bore, as the consumption side of New York was, and as the consumption side of. So I think that the basic human love of being around other human beings is just, and taking care of all of the pleasures that urban entrepreneurship can create. All of that stuff isn't going away. And sort of the surest, guarantee of London's long run success is the fact that London has been synonymous with pleasure for at least 250 years, since Dr. Johnson famously opined that when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. So I think the fact that people want to be in the city is a really important thing. And that's one of the problems that many American cities are having because they've not managed to maintain that. So a city like San Francisco or a city like Seattle, which, before the pandemic was a jewel, because of policing problems gone awry, because of open air fentanyl markets, because of chaos in public transportation, the pleasure side has really been challenged. Now, on the pure work side, I want to start out just by highlighting, work from home is an elite phenomenon, and we have to, this is relevant for non-urbanites, but it's also relevant for those urbanites who don't have fancy degrees, who are not knowledge workers, who are not. In May 2020 in the United States, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely. So comfortably over 2/3. 5% of Americans who are high school dropouts were working remotely. 15% of Americans with only a high school degree were working remotely. And if you go to the current population survey in the United States, which is an attempt to be, it's not an internet-based survey, it's an address-based survey, so it's attempts to be much more representative. The number there is about 11% of Americans are sort of full-time remote, and about 11% of Americans are partially remote. So those numbers are much lower than the numbers that you get from internet-based things, which does not mean the internet-based surveys aren't capturing an important reality. They are capturing a reality. They're capturing a reality for basically all of the world that uses the internet regularly, which is a pretty darn important part of the world. But I think it's important that we remember that there's part of the world that isn't that. One of the reasons to highlight that is that typically in cities like London, the export industries, the people who are bringing money into the city, are the internet-heavy part of the world. And they are then spending money with employing the urban service workers who are not the internet-heavy part of the world. And that's one of the challenges of, you move from a 5-day-a-week model to a 3-day-a-week model. Maybe that works fine for you, but those are 2 days that no one's, that there's no demand at the sandwich shop. Those are 2 days that there's no demand at the cafe. And so that's substantially reducing demand for the urban service workers who used to be near you. Now, in terms of the knowledge workers themselves, my view is that typically for many jobs, it's just as easy to do old tasks you know well, relationships you've had for years. You can do those things long distance and it works. So my book, Survival of the City, was written with my co-author David Cutler. We did not see each other live during a single day in which, in fact, that book could also be written, the book that enabled me to survive lockdown without going nuts. That's a reasonable thing. But David and I have been writing papers together for well over 30 years. We can finish each other's sentences. It's not as if we don't know each other very, very well. And at the same time, our ability to onboard new PhD students was terrible. I mean, it was very hard to do new relationships. One of the ways we see this statistically is both Nick Bloom's work from 10 years ago using Chinese travel agency workers, and the work of Emma Harrington and Natalia Emanuel using US call center workers at a large US retailer finds exactly the same thing. You send call center workers home, they can make just as many calls. In fact, sometimes they can make more calls than if they were in the office because there are fewer distractions. But both studies show a probability of being promoted that drops by more than 50%. Okay. And I think this is very much the view that, they can do the old tasks, but they aren't learning how to be a better call center worker. Or perhaps their boss isn't learning that they're any good at their job, right? We're cutting off the sort of dynamic learning channels. And that's what's really sacrificed by being away. Now, maybe, being in work 70% of the time is a sweet spot. Maybe you get enough learning from the 70% you're around, and that sort of levels off. I don't know. But it's, I feel pretty confident that anyone who expects to accumulate human capital and to learn how to do their job better be spending a lot of the time actually around other people who know their business, who they can learn from.
Yeah, and you know, the work that you've done and others, I mean, you know, it's very crucial. We have these sort of conversations, you know, as you say, the distinction between new and existing, I think is a really important distinction. I don't think that's really been pulled out. I think the short and the medium and the long term effects are also get all jumbled up in that sense. Immediately, we don't see a drop off in productivity, but then that gets extrapolated through until, you know, into the far distance. I don't buy that. I mean, the other point you make about urban service workers, we did some work looking at card transaction data, and what was quite obvious was that, you know, the concentration of workers in a place in and of itself then drove demand for urban service workers. When they weren't there, you lose concentration, not least because they're dispersed, but actually when they were working from home, they were actually spending less. You know, it wasn't that they were spending the corresponding amount in their locality, wherever they lived, they actually weren't spending. Now, that might be good or bad, but it's not just simply a displacement effect where they just take their pound from central city and they take it to suburban place X. They don't spend it. So that in itself has a sort of interesting dynamic as well. I mean, but I suppose, you know, very simply, is it a case, or should we think about this, Ed, in that if you just, you know, if there are less people around, you just get less agglomeration benefits? Is that too a crude a way of thinking about it? I mean, that's a very simplistic perspective, but just unpack that a little bit for us. You know, talk a little bit about, you know, where we see returns to scale and density and all of that within the literature and what that might mean.
So certainly the general literature has found returns to agglomeration pretty much everywhere that it looks. It sees it in the wage regressions, it sees it in productivity regressions, more density. You know, the more dense neighborhoods of New York are vastly more productive than the least dense neighborhoods of New York. Now, part of this is selection and part of this is treatment, meaning that it's also because more productive people are working in these particularly dense areas. But I think, you know, the overwhelming consensus is a great deal of this is treatment. What I don't know is, because we haven't gone through this before, I don't know whether or not a lot of people there 3 days a week is, you know, is that like 60%, you know, as dense area, or is it like a 90% as dense area? It's clearly a reduction of some form, but we don't know. This sort of temporal spacing is a new thing, and it's going to be a while before we can sort out what actually this means. So the spillovers for the urban service workers on Monday and Friday, that's direct. But how much creativity we're going to lose, how much productivity we're going to lose in terms of the knowledge industries themselves, that's much less clear to me.
Yeah. As an aside, just for a second,
yeah.
You know, you're obviously, you know, you're hugely productive in your own right as an urban economist researcher, but you're also plugged into the urban economics research field more generally. You know, are there lots and lots of different studies now underway to try and figure out some of these implications from the urban scale about how, you know, return to the office or work from home, whichever you want to look at it, how this is going to play out? Do you have a sense that this has become, you know, a big topic issue for lots of urban economists and researchers?
Yes, it was. I would say it was a bigger topic in 2021 than it is in 2024. So there were a lot of papers, particularly sort of looking at the early gleanings, looking at, for example, the relative rise in suburban housing prices and suburban rents relative to urban rents. Now, much of that has converged. Okay, so there was a really wide difference between in rent growth. I mean, just demand for suburban homes just went crazy in 2020, 2021. And a fair amount of that has narrowed over time. We don't know how much there's the decline in urban office values has been, because many of those things are not publicly traded, so it's hard to tell. But I think, you know, there's a fair consensus that there's been a lot of land value lost in terms of the office market. I think that's a thing the research community has agreed on. I would say the area that we know least about is whether or not we're actually going to lose productivity in the long run or creativity in the long run. And if you think about it, it's just hard to study that because you don't have randomized controlled trials in this. There's a you know, data on productivity appears with often terrible lags. So that's I think the hardest thing to know about. But you know, it's the property values that tend to show up first. So those are the things that we know we've had the most research on.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on that. I mean, I know you've been asked and have written and talked about, the sort of the property implications, I suppose, of the changes that we've seen both on the residential side, but also on the commercial side. In a sense of what's happening to commercial property, both in terms of how much it's used or utilization, but also then prices, and whether that whether some of that will clear through the market as we emerge. Don't know, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that. Corresponded to that, I think we certainly see this in London. I'm sure we're seeing this I know we're seeing this in New York. There's now big calls, big claims that we need to change the composition of our central business districts. Maybe they were too, mono-orientated around commercial. Now they need to be a bit more residential, a bit more leisure, a bit more something else, rather than solely focused on offices. So be interested in just, unpacking the implications for the durable nature of the city, which is essentially the infrastructure and the buildings. Where do you think we are on that? What's your reading of that?
So I think before COVID, the fact that London, New York, Chicago had these vast, highly centered office markets was something of an asset because it created unbelievable agglomeration economies. I think it's now something of a curse. And these cities have done somewhat worse because of it. It would be healthier if residential spaces were peppered throughout. It would be healthier if we just were more mixed throughout. Now, the conversion of space is enormously costly. Okay. And, I think zoning codes, land use codes should make it easy to convert from a regulatory perspective, but there's no repealing just the basic engineering rules that make it fairly hard to convert one form of space into another. So we're seeing experiments. That's great. I wish these experiments well, but it's I think it's going to be a hard lift. The one thing that is obvious to me is that this is yet another reason why so-called Euclidean zoning is a disaster, right? We do not want to have rules which artificially segregate uses. We do not want offices artificially segregated from residences because a more mixed neighborhood is just far more resilient to this kind of shock. Because you have, people still want to be in the city for the joys of it, even if they don't want to be there for the production side of it. And so that's the one obvious takeaway from this, that, we really want to have regulations that permit all sorts of things to happen in all sorts of places.
And you wouldn't be worried about the sort of the gains from the resilience and the mixed use, but the losses from the specialization and the concentration, on the assumption, I guess, that specialization can't be recovered, I suppose, would be the way to think about that. I mean, I'll give you an example. The City of London for a long time has always resisted having lots more residents in it, because they've always said, until relatively recently, that actually gets in the way of the business of the city, which often has very unsocial hours, deliveries being made at 4 o'clock in the morning, etc., etc. It's not good for residents. But I don't know. I sort of, what's your take on that?
I think if the city has its rules which allow 4 a.m. deliveries, then that's fine. Those rules should continue. But if people want to build some residences nearby, they should be allowed to do that. That's I think where I am. I don't see there being a major hurt to the offices that are created by having residences nearby. If anything, it's something of an asset, because having the residences nearby can maintain a different mix of restaurants, and probably a healthier mix of restaurants or a healthier mix of stores.
Yeah. On this theme, we've had quite a few questions on the role of policy, and should we care about all of this, as it were, at the aggregate level, which we'll come on to shortly. But one of the proposals, I mean, it wasn't only around when the pandemic hit and then the change pattern, but it was garnered around that, and it galvanized it a bit, was the idea of 15-minute cities. In a sense, that was sort of all the 15-minute neighborhoods. That was a kind of response to that, the biases of central city, etc. You've again written on this. Just your thoughts, and actually what the work that you've done and colleagues have done around, when we look at that in reality, what does that actually do? What does it actually look and feel like? Because it's got a lot of attention and interest in the UK. It's a sort of, it's one of those, the latest, greatest idea is 15-minute neighborhoods, etc., etc.
So to the extent to which 15-minute neighborhoods means an elimination of land use rules that make it difficult to open up restaurants in particular areas or open up shops, I'm all for it. To the extent to which the 15-minute neighborhoods mean we're going to recognize that walking is a great way to get around cities, and we're going to make sure that walking is safe and easy, I'm all for it. And to the extent to which 15-minute cities means that from the public health perspective, we're going to try to make sure that we have medical services that are available to people in a convenient way, I'm all for that as well. But I am deeply hostile to the notion that we're going to splinter our great metropolises into separate 15-minute neighborhoods and think of that as a useful thing to do. Ultimately, connection is what cities are all about. And when, as an American who is, has worked on and is keenly aware of the terrible legacies of American segregation, the terrible legacies of America's attempting to zone by race, to artificially create pockets that can only exist for African Americans and pockets that only exist for whites, the history of the use of restrictive covenants to try to make sure that those things emerge, and the terrible consequences of segregation for African Americans, but I think for also whites as well. The 15-minute cities just feels just completely wrong to me. And certainly when we look at poor urbanites, and this comes from work with Carlo Ratti, Timur Abisyoff, and many other co-authors, we're looking at cell phone mobility, and we're looking across different neighborhoods. And we look at both 15-minute neighborhoods, by which we mean places that have more stuff within 15 minutes, and 15-minute neighborhoods, meaning places where people stay within those neighborhoods more often. If we look at experienced segregation of the poor, so poor people interacting with rich people and vice versa, the poor who live in 15-minute neighborhoods, by either definition, just live much more segregated lives. And I think the last thing that we want is to increase the segregation of our society. We want to work for a world in which our cities are connected, in which poor people, come into work and interact with rich people, and they both benefit through that. And I think that's a really important thing. I mean, one of the things that has fascinated and troubled me is that cities still appear to be relatively great places to be an adult, right? You come to London, you come to New York, you come to Chicago. It's not just that your wages go up immediately, it's that you experience faster wage growth year by year, month by month. You do better. And this is very much, I think, compatible with the view that cities are forges of human capital, places where we get smart by being around other smart people. But at the same time, the work of my colleague Raj Chetty, looking at kids in high density areas, kids end up really doing poorly in America's high density areas. Now, we're worse. I don't want to generalize the American experience to anywhere else, right? Because our urban schools are particularly problematic, and they have been for many, many decades. But I think one way to rationalize the fact that cities appear to be great for adults and bad for kids, at least in America, is that American adults seem to live relatively integrated lives. They work in integrated firms. They experience lots of mixing. American kids, not so much. They go to segregated schools. They play in segregated neighborhoods. And with work with Cody Cook and Lindsay Currier, we've actually tried to focus on the cell phone mobility of younger people, which is pretty hard to identify. But you see a real difference between people who live in rich places and people who live in poor places in just their ability to sample the city. I mean, people who live in rich places, kids who live in rich places are like, they're traveling everywhere. They're going to places. They're going to have fun. The poor kids are really living a much more cloistered life. And for all those reasons, I'm in favor of embracing the connected metropolis rather than the 15-minute city.
Yeah, no, that's a great insight. And it touches on this issue. I'll come on to that in a second, but just on what you said. So in terms of career progression and wage progression, this is where I'm asking you to imagine something, Ed. So, you being the uber urban economist, you'll deal with this in your own perfect way. But might we imagine into the future that we get a bit of a bifurcation in terms of the labor market, in the sense that career progression, wage progression is quicker and higher and better for those that are more disposed or more willing to sort of be in face-to-face proximity versus those that tend to not want to go down that route? I mean, that's kind of what we see already, right? By dint of experience. If you're in big cities, you progress more. If you're not in big cities, you don't progress as much. That's a choice question. But do you see further bifurcation between some of those issues on a work from home, work in the office front?
I certainly believe, this is exactly what the Harrington and Emanuel study showed, is that those workers who were not coming in, this is pre-pandemic, had a 50% lower chance of being promoted. Right? That's a huge difference. And if you think about call center workers, like what being promoted means is you get to handle the tough calls, right? How would you learn how to handle the tough calls if you were all by yourself? How would your boss know that you were good at doing it if you're handling it by yourself? And certainly if I just think about my own life, I mean, a huge amount of my learning has occurred through face-to-face contacts that I didn't possibly imagine, that I would benefit from. What strikes me as particularly strange in our current work from home moment is the number of 20-somethings who particularly value the work from home amenity. And what's crazy about that is these are exactly the people who stand to gain the most. I mean, I understand when my 70-year-old colleague says they want to work from home or they don't want to come in, right? I understand that. It makes me feel sad because I lose something, but I understand that decision. But I don't understand the decision of a 25-year-old who presumably should be trying to learn as much as possible from the people around them. And they're just not going to learn it if they're just dialing it in from a Starbucks or a Cafe Nero, if you prefer.
And so just on that, what was interested in the study that we did, what we saw was actually, which was a bit of a surprise to us because conventional wisdom and where lots of stories emerge, it seemed to be that the younger cohort, at least in London, unlike the other big cities, were more into the office, more, rather than their 35, 45 plus sort of middle managers, upper managers that tended not to be in the office. And there's an interesting question, which is, if we want our youngsters to a younger cohort to learn, they need to have the experienced people around them. And so, there's a sort of dynamic going on there, because whilst being around your younger colleagues is probably invigorated and fun, the learning element may be somewhat reduced. I don't know what you think about that.
This strikes me as being quite important and something that firms need to handle. So I remember having a conversation during the pandemic with a friend of mine who's a enormously accomplished editor for a major American newspaper. And he had relocated to Florida during the pandemic, and he said he loved it, and he didn't see any downside for him of doing it. He knew his business and was going to keep on knowing his business and didn't particularly worry. But he did admit that, like, the 20-somethings were, maybe not getting so much out of him in Florida as they would have elsewhere. Now, the firm, presumably, the reason it gets to hire bright 20-somethings is they think they'll come and learn something there. So the firm presumably has to figure out some way to compensate the older workers or nudge them to get them back in the office. So they create that kind of learning environment for younger people, if this is going to return. But I think it's ultimately the firm's job to figure out how to, rekindle that positive synergy between the young and the old that I think makes firms productive learning environments.
And I mean, this is a weird one because in a sense, the literature on the efficiency of the firm as a way to organize tasks and individuals is long, and lots of people have been very famous on writing all of that sort of stuff. But part of it seems to be that do firm owners or to the middle managers actually know what makes their firms successful, and maybe they're not making the decisions that are optimal in the medium term. It may be optimal in the short term, that they can do whatever they're doing, but actually in the medium term it may not be optimal for the firm's success. I don't know. I mean, just how do we reconcile that if we believe that, information markets function in the way that other types of markets work, and that information is available to those middle managers?
Absolutely. So there's both lack of information. We may not know what works. I mean, quite honestly, none of us know exactly what works. Two, even if you know what works, like, you're not the company's owner. You're a manager. And if your workers really don't want to show up, it's a hard thing to get them to show up. I had a deep personal tragedy occur to me over the last 3 years. I was department chair of the economics department here. Luckily that's cleared up, so you don't need to worry about me anymore. But the joys of being a department chair are you get to be you're a middle manager in a very large and not always super functional not-for-profit institution. So that's what it means to be a department chair. And like many middle managers, I was dealing with the problem of trying to get people to show up. And the question is, how much personal capital are you going to burn trying to get someone to show up? And they've got a legitimate reason why they don't want to show up, and it's all a pain in the neck. So all of that is totally true, and it's hard. And on top of that, even in the best of circumstances, and this is an idea that goes back to my mentor Gary Becker, who wrote his book Human Capital in 1964. firms don't always internalize. They don't always get the financial benefit from the learning that their workers have on the job. I mean, if the workers are going to take that learning and then go work for someone else, then the firm doesn't necessarily want to encourage that learning. And that's another reason why, our firms may not be working as hard as they perhaps should be to try and create learning environments.
And if you found that difficult, and you've been in the economics department at Harvard University for quite a while, so for those that are, maybe they may be in their firms for a few months or even for a few years, their sense of belonging may not be, may not be as extreme, and they're not prepared to make the hard decisions or take the hard choices. That's an interesting point around the optimization within the firm and who's best placed to take it. We've had quite a few questions, I said, on policy, on some of the aspects that you've talked about in terms of the opaqueness of land value and property transactions actually inhibits our ability to fully understand what's going on. Some other questions about whether the state of the commercial real estate markets in certain places, does that warrant further or deeper public policy interventions, and if so, of what type? So I suppose let's start with a fundamental kind of question on public policy, Ed, which is, we've talked about what's happening. This is the aggregation or the disaggregation of individual choices that individual firms and or individuals are making about how to work and when to work. Should public policy care? I mean, should we, and in what way should we care? And we'll get into some of the specifics about what we might then do, but just where should public policy be on all of this sort of, this? We just let it happen and step back, don't get in the way, don't make it worse, do no harm. What's your thought on that?
So I continue to view that sort of cities are at their best when they compete for talent, and that the best economic development strategy is to attract and train smart people and get out of their way. One of the things we haven't highlighted is that not only does Zoom make it easier to work from home, it also makes it easier just to relocate. So in some sense, talent has never been more mobile, in part because let's take our sort of like high-end tech firm, 30-year-olds, 15 of them. These people sort of know that they want to be together, but they also know that, I don't know, they like swimming in the Mediterranean. They like paying lower taxes. They like lots of things which don't necessarily go with location in either New York or London. And so they may choose to relocate. And that's become easier than ever because they can Zoom with their accountants. They can Zoom with their venture capitalists. They can Zoom with their lawyers. And I think that's really, to me, one of the sort of main points of the Zoom revolution is we've, in some sense, heated up the global battle for talent. And so for me, the first order thing, and this is both about working from home and about retaining talent, is to just work on the quality of life front. Right. It's just to make sure that cities continue to be places where, people want to live, where they're excited about being. And that means, public safety is hugely important. And this has, of course, been a huge problem for some of America's most well-functioning cities prior to the pandemic, partially because the pandemic occurred at the same time as the Black Lives Matter movement. And while I have enormous sympathy for the need for police reform in the United States, you can't just not have policing. This doesn't work. And when that coincides with an incredibly well-educated population that can easily work from home and doesn't want to go in if there's any lack of safety, then downtowns like San Francisco just have experienced enormous negative shocks in terms of quality of life. And that's a huge problem. But of course, it's also about sort of empowering entrepreneurship. In the US, and I try to only criticize my own country's policies on this, but in the US, it is outrageous the fact that we make it so much more difficult for low-skilled people to be entrepreneurs than we make it difficult for high-skilled people to be entrepreneurs. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, you can have 1 billion users before a regulator knows you exist. If you want to start your sandwich shop that sells milk products 3 blocks away, you have 15 permits to get through. And that's not just a problem in terms of upward mobility, but that's also a problem in terms of just making the city fun and functional as well. So I think the permitting reform agenda is an important one. And I will say, while it doesn't lead to, public policies that mandate returning to work. I don't know how you could possibly do that. I think there is a special need for to sort of think about this precisely because you have all these less educated, less fortunate urban service workers, the guys who open the sandwich shops, who are kind of dependent upon the high-skilled people for their business. And so for that reason, I think doing a little rooting for coming back to work is for big city leaders is totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I mean, we picked this up in the the report. This is long-standing. It's not just a recent thing. You know, there's a requirement, for example, for Paris employers to pay part of the commute costs of their workers. Now, how that interacts with wages is, you know, we would expect all of that to play out in the wash. So there's a sort of, but there's a recognition of the cost of travel, as it were, is part and parcel, and it certainly comes up in some of our work and others that, you know, now that there's an option, the commute seems to be more prohibitive now than it was in the past, when it was probably you had to do it rather than you necessarily wanted to do it. In London, you know, TfL for a period, probably not long enough and with enough fanfare, run a sort of Friday fares trial where they were reducing some of the cost of on-peak use of the transport system to encourage greater Friday use. It seemed to have some positive effect, not large, but did have positive effect. Probably wasn't aware enough, so people didn't understand what was available and therefore probably underused it. But I mean, there's a sort of an experimentation sort of aspect, but it's all based on the premise that, implicit as much as explicit, that these sort of public policy agents want more workers back into the city centre. And I just wonder what that's public policy taking a position that we want more people back than we currently have got. And I don't know, I'm interested what your thoughts are on that. And I suppose there's a success question, is can we actually do it? But there's an implicit perspective on, you know, what is that an appropriate view or perspective for policy to hold?
I think a discounts on Friday are just fine. They're also justifiable, just, you know, from a revenue gain perspective, because you may want to you may actually get more revenues if you cut prices and get more people to show up. I think a bit of rooting on the sidelines for people to show up is fine. I don't see any problem with that. I mean, you know, the sort of slightly libertarian side of me is always a little bit anxious about trying to cajole choices. But, you know, whether or not you believe there are going to be a bit of extra agglomeration economies, whether or not you care about the extra purchases from the low-skilled urban service workers, lots of reasons to like having people come in a little bit more often. But, you know, don't make it heavy-handed. I think I would not be in favor of sort of a draconian government policy. I think a little bit of nudging around the edges and cheerleading around the edges is just fine. But I wouldn't be in favor of a government policy that, I don't know, mandates or forces or whatever that you can do. So yeah, I think that's where I am on this.
It's sort of trying to exactly. It's trying to find the balance. And I suppose in part, you know, part of the issue that came up in the conversation at our launch event yesterday evening, you know, which was if and this is a big if, you know, if we worry over time that there are economy-wide negative effects from the changed behaviours, you know, we might want to then think about how we might stimulate behaviours or decisions that actually try to recover some of that lost progression or that lost productivity or that lost innovation just because of where we are, rather than being sort of agnostic about where we are, and it's sort of some. I don't know what you think about that.
That's interesting. So I think that's something we certainly should be open to. I also want to highlight a slight difference between the UK and the US on this. That in the US, you know, for example, Boston is basically the downtown. There's a little bit else around it. And when the mayor of Boston, who of course is championing people coming back, she's basically championing people coming in from the suburbs, coming into her city and shopping in her city. Now, there is not a mayor in the world who shouldn't be doing that. That's an entirely reasonable thing, because you're trying to advocate for your residents, and your residents benefit when people come in from outside. That's a little bit easier than if you are the mayor of a larger territory that includes all the suburbanites, where you're sort of trying to tell them where to go. And I think that's a harder thing to justify than this sort of decentralized kind of thing. So I think doing at those higher levels, doing a little bit of nudging is probably okay. But again, I would be worried about going too far on this, precisely because there are upsides to working from home, and you don't want to necessarily, you know, act as if that's not a legitimate thing for many people to do.
Yeah. Come back to something you said slightly. You know, you said essentially, you know, successful cities, or cities, particularly the cities that we're talking about, essentially they're in a competition for talent. They want, you know, the best and the brightest to be in their place, you know, doing the things that they're doing, learning and teaching others. I wonder, you know, over time, you know, we noticed that, you know, Paris has got more people back than, say, Toronto and London. I suppose, you know, can you imagine that becoming a sort of almost a selling point? You know, I haven't yet heard the Parisian mayor say, more people are back in our place. If you come here, you'll have a better experience. You might progress your career more quickly than other places. Your wages might increase more quickly than I've not heard, any mayors say that. And I wonder whether they ultimately will. I don't know. I mean, but it's an interesting sort of dynamic about selling your place, right? It's just like there's more people about, the experience is better, or whatever, the learning experience is more dynamic.
So this has been, the past, just a fact in the US, no variable predicts metropolitan area growth, population growth over the last 120 years more reliably than January temperature. Warmth is just the big predictor of which areas in the US grow faster than others. And it's true within the UK as well. It's just the climate differences are much smaller than they are within the US. But that's gone on steroids over the last 4 years, right? Just the enormous growth of places like Austin, Texas, which has just taken off, or Phoenix, and one part of that is they had very different lockdowns. They had very different pandemic experiences. People were not, sheltering as much. The legal responses were much more modest, and people are just much more back in those areas. I don't know that I've heard mayors explicitly say that, but at the very least, it's a subtext that runs through the flight to the sun over the last 3 or 4 years, is that, things are back and normal in Dallas and Houston, and they're not in San Francisco. And that's one other reason to come to Texas or to come to Phoenix.
Yeah.
So it is sort of part of the US competitive discussion.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. A kind of broader question, I think, really. I mean, you talked about it earlier on, Ed, as well, which is, you alluded to some of the challenges that urban areas in the US are facing, and similarly, that'll be the same in the other countries, whether it's Canada or whether it's in the UK or mainland Europe, etc. Some of the sort of challenges that are there, they predated COVID. I just wonder, when we think about where we are in the moment, and particularly the emphasis around working from home and all of those sorts of things that, that's fueled in the debates and discussions, does that distract really from some of the more fundamental kind of questions? You talked about urban safety, urban policing, talked about urban schooling, urban education. We've got some of those issues. They play out in slightly different ways, but, some of our, places are not great places for providing our children with the education and the skills they need to be competitive in the labour market. They've got vast numbers of adult population with no formal qualifications, which inhibits their ability to be successful in the modern economy. I mean, in a sense, are we distracted by this thing? And how do you think about that? Or is it shone a light on, what's happening in urban areas, and that gives us a bigger platform, a bigger mandate to talk about these other questions and issues as well?
So that, I mean, your latter course is certainly the course that I took in Survival of the City, and I will continue to take, which is precisely because people are more mobile, either going to the suburbs or leaving the metropolitan area altogether, is all the more reason why we have to tackle these long-standing urban troubles. One of the dangers, though, and of this is, and it feels to me like a bit of a replay of the 1970s, is at least in the US, we were at this very progressive moment in terms of the urban debate in 2020, right? A lot of desire to right historical inequities, defund the police, take money from rich people, give money to poor people, and so forth. The problem is, if you try to do that at the local level, especially in a moment of high levels of mobility, the rich just move out. Companies move out. And that's exactly what happened to US cities in the 1970s, is we were at this very progressive moment in the early 1970s. Mayors like John Lindsay in New York, or a little bit earlier, Jerome Kavanaugh in Detroit, ready to champion the downtrodden and take from the rich and give to the poor. Well, the rich just left, and the city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. And I think it's really important that we, don't let the work from home thing distract us from the need to make our schools better, to make our cities safer, but 2, to figure out ways to do those, which are not just robbing Peter to pay Paul. That we actually need to get better at policing, not just spend vastly more on it. We need to actually get better at schooling, not just throwing more money at the problem. And I think that's a really central thing to me, is that sort of, for me at least, the frontier is urban management, is trying to get all of our core urban services to be as good as they can possibly be. Yeah,
and that touches on, I mean, you're familiar, but I appreciate not as familiar with where we are in sort of in the UK, and particularly in, there's an ongoing debate, as discussion about the relative empowerment of cities and city governments or city region governments relative to to central government, as you know, heavily centralized in the UK relative to other places. You know, and you've looked at this in different ways. You've looked at sort of governance fragmentation and fractionalization, etc. So those sort of things. There's an interesting kind of question around, you know, if you think about the skills system or the schooling system or the police system, not exclusively, but much of that stuff in the UK, those policy levers of substance are all national in orientation rather than, you know, city in orientation or metro in orientation. You know, what's your learned experience on that? You know, if we are to do something about, you know, the difficult nature of our skills profiles in some of our urban areas, is that an empowerment of the cities? Let them get on with it. Let them do more of the supply and matching of supply and demand, is the skilling up and sector. What do we learn from the work that you and others have done? So
in terms of there is certainly a literature in the US that thinks that competition among schools can be helpful. That competition is not necessarily benefiting the least skilled people. I particularly like the idea. So I've been engaged in the school reform movement in the US for about 20 years, and I'm feeling a little burnt right now about the difficulties involved in reforming America's big city schools. And I like the idea of something like after school, summer vocational training programs that are outsourced. So you can actually, and the beauty of vocational training, again, this is not to substitute. This is not sort of, you know, you're not going to get your normal degree. This is on top of this, we're going to teach you to code. On top of this, we're going to teach you to be a plumber. The beauty of vocational training is you can test at the end as to whether or not they learn those skills, and then you can pay for performance. So if you didn't teach them to be a carpenter, you don't get paid. Done. And so because of that, we can get more competition into the system. You can say, you know, private entities, sure, go ahead and compete. You're not going to get paid unless you actually teach them the skills. So you're not going to have the sort of degree mills that we have with the for-profit schools at the high end. So I think getting more competition into things is typically a good thing to do. And I think, you know, the UK system has the advantage that it can reform itself quickly, but at least if it were me, I would be looking for let's you know, have some central direction, but trying to get a little more competition at the lower level, a little bit more of ability to have local innovation to try to push stuff forward. Yeah, well, that's it. That is a very good point. We've got a few minutes left. I suppose come back to where we started, really. Just allow you to say a little bit more. I mean, and obviously we've exclusively talked about cities in the developed world, and I know increasingly, you know, you're doing an awful lot of work in, you know, the role of cities and in the developing world, which is a whole different subject. But, you know, given where we are, you know, where we seem to have settled, I mean, how do you see, you know, what's your guesses or, you know, educated guesses in terms of the next few years, particularly on some of those big urban areas, the New Yorks, the Chicagos, the Londons, the Parises? Where do you see the sort of urban agenda for those sort of places over the next few years? What do you think they're going to be focused on? Let me make one large observation, and then I'll focus in a little bit more. You know, in 1980, in the aftermath of, you know, the urban crisis of the 1970s, Alvin Toffler wrote in The Third Wave that the rise of information technology was going to make face-to-face contact in the cities that enable that contact obsolete. And he depicted a world of empty office skyscrapers and everyone working from home. And for the next 39 years, he was completely and totally wrong. Okay, this was a great period of urban rebirth, not a period of urban death. And what he missed is that what globalization and new technologies did is they radically increased the returns to being smart. They radically increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. Then all of a sudden, in 2020, we had a pandemic, which made face-to-face contact look a lot less appealing. And we had an improvement in our long-distance communication methods, both of which suddenly made Toffler's ideas far more relevant. But given that, you know, I spent a lot of my career, at least 25 years in it, saying that, you know, just wait a minute with this view, that there are other things that happen, that, you know, in a more complex world, the easier it is for ideas to get lost if we're not in the same room with one another. Given this history, I think, you know, I would not count face-to-face contact out, and I certainly would not count out our great cities. I think they do need to manage themselves better. I think we do need to, you know, have a focus on delivering better urban services. Sometimes that will mean decentralization. Sometimes that will mean other sorts of methods. We also have to have a focus on better delivery of urban services that particularly cares for poor people. We can't just think that policing that sort of treats ordinary people as if they're criminals is acceptable. That means we probably need to measure more, because what Peter Drucker said about what gets measured gets managed is actually right. But I think if we take the work from home thing as a bit of a wake-up call and just realize that this is a moment to sort of double down on making our cities more functional, more humane, more open, I think it can be a great period for all of our great cities. And I can't think of a greater city than London.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'd said at the beginning it was a big subject, but we had the perfect person to address it. And I think the last hour has certainly proven that point. As always, it's a great pleasure and a great privilege to have you with us. I thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And as I said, next time you're in London, we will definitely do something in person. So thank you again
Absolutely.
for making your time available to us.
Thank you for having me on.
Go well. Take care. Thanks, Ed. Bye.
Bye.